We want to finish up with our circulatory system notes this week and probably be looking at a quiz coming up early next week. I know. So we really just finished the heart anatomy was where we got to in our circulatory system notes. We need to finish up with the rest of it. So that's what we're going to be working on most of this week. So the first thing is, there's some pictures now that we added to the notes that come from the bodies exhibit. I believe it's still there. In New York City, it used to be in Times Square, may move. There's the bodies exhibit. It's part of Discover. But what they do is people have donated their bodies to this organization. What they do is they preserve them and then display them in different ways to help people understand and learn and be interested in how the human body works. So that's what some of these pictures are. So this, for example, is the preserved heart and lungs of a person, and it's been color-coded like we often do with, deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. So if we look here, this is what it really looks like. So we have the trachea. You could see these rings around it. Those are the rings of cartilage that reinforces our trachea, our windpipe, so it stays nice and firm. Then you see the lungs. So remember, our lungs are not just like two bags or two balloons that fill up with air. They're made really of all of these tiny branches and little clusters of air sacs. So that's why they look like this. They don't just look like a hollow. Sometimes we draw them and it just looks like sort of a smooth thing. But really, it's made of all these tiny little air sacs. And you can see that much better in this. And then we have the heart here and some of the blood vessels. Okay? So if we look here, what chamber of the heart is this? Raise your hand if you can tell me what chamber this is. Ryan?
White aorta? What do they call them? White.
Yeah, you're getting there.
Okay.
Right, it is the right side of the heart. And the top chamber? Right. It's the right, but what is the name, Maya?
Right atrium?
Atrium. Yep, starts with an A. There's a lot of A words, sometimes it gets confusing. So that's the right atrium. What's this? Raise your hand if you can tell me this chamber, Blake.
The right ventricle.
Yeah, that's the right ventricle. Now you see this too coming down into the right atrium?
The vena cava.
That's the vena cava. And then this blood's going to get pumped here out into the lungs. Then it returns. You can see the chambers. This is the left atrium, left ventricle, and then this is the aorta.
Artery.
So that's what it would actually look like. Ready? So let's talk about blood. So blood is obviously an important part of our circulatory system. Was this our question of the day yesterday? Or I didn't give you one. Yeah. So blood is really two things. It's a liquid portion, which we call plasma, which transports all the other parts of the blood, because the rest of the blood are cells and cell parts. Right?
Isn't plasma supposed to be like really hot?
Yeah, that's a different word. That plasma as a state of matter is something completely different from this. It's the same word, but kind of two different meanings. So in our blood, plasma is just the liquid part of our blood. It's the same thing really as lymph. When we talk about our body fluid as lymph, it's the same stuff. All right, so this plasma, this liquid part is important. It's most of our blood, actually. About 55% of our blood is plasma.
So like 11/20.
So 55% of it is this liquidy plasma. And the plasma is where glucose, vitamins, minerals, they would all sort of be dissolved in this liquidy part. So that's important because it carries those nutrients. Sorry. If you separate it, the plasma is kind of a yellowish color. But we don't see that because we have other parts in there that make our blood look different from that. So we have our plasma. Then inside that plasma, sort of being carried, like sort of pebbles being carried down a river, are some other things, the cells of our blood. One important part of the red blood cells. Now red blood cells, obviously they're red. Do you remember what they do? What is the job of a red blood cell? Maya?
Carries oxygen?
Yeah, they carry oxygen. They look like these sort of frisbees or like donuts with the middle filled in, and their job is to carry oxygen. We know that an important function of our blood is to provide oxygen to our cells. Well, the part of the blood that actually can grab onto the oxygen are the red blood cells. And they can do this because they have a special chemical in them, a special protein called hemoglobin. And this hemoglobin binds to an oxygen and carries it from our lungs, hopefully to our cells. And hemoglobin has iron in it. This is one of the reasons why we need iron in our diet, because hemoglobin has iron as one of its important elements. If we don't get enough iron, our blood cells don't have the right amount of hemoglobin, and we can't get enough oxygen to our cells, and we may become tired or weak, and that's what we call anemia. So it can be caused by a lack of iron. So red blood cells are one important part of our cells. And there's also some white blood cells. White blood cells have a different job. Does anybody know what that job is, Eddie?
Don't they help fight diseases?
They do. They fight off pathogens. They help protect us from disease. It's a part of our immune system, our body's defense system. And let's say, for example, you got strep throat. Well, what happens in your body is when your body detects a pathogen like the strep bacteria, it sort of gears up and it creates more white blood cells to help fight off that infection. So the number of white blood cells increases when you're sick. And then once you're healthy again, it'll come back down. You know, sometimes people may go to the doctor and they may not be feeling well, they may have some problems, but they don't know exactly why. One thing that the doctor may do is have a complete blood count, where they look at a sample of a person's blood and they see how many red blood cells are there, how many white blood cells. If they find that there's an elevated level of white blood cells, they may think that you have an infection somewhere that you may not know about. White blood cells are much larger than red blood cells. There's not as many of them, though. And they come in different shapes and sizes. The immune system is very complex, and there's different types of cells that do different things. But we're just going to give an overview and say white blood cells help fight off infection. And then we have one other portion of our blood. Those are called platelets. And platelets are important because they allow our blood to clot. What does that mean when we say that clot? Allows our blood to clot. You know what that means? Okay. Connell?
Make new blood cells?
Not quite, not making new ones. Maya?
Well, it like stops it from going to certain places.
It can. A blood clot can block the flow of blood.
It helps stop, like, if you're bleeding, if you stop that.
Yep. By doing what a clot is basically these platelets clump up together. Normally they're just sort of floating around in our blood, separated, these platelets. But when they detect an injury, when they're exposed to the air, they start to all clump together and form a solid little mass or a little net. And what happens if we have some damage to a blood vessel, if you cut your skin, you get a paper cut, and it starts bleeding, what happens is these platelets, once they detect that damage, they start to clump together, and they basically plug up the damage in your blood vessels. and stop you from bleeding. So blood clot is very important because if your blood didn't clot and you got a big cut, you would just keep bleeding and bleeding. Blood clots stop you from bleeding. And so this picture here shows when the platelets are not activated, they're just sort of loose and separate. But once they are activated and there's an injury, they all sort of start to stick together and form this mesh that seals up the wound. Now, have you heard about times when a blood clot is not a good thing? When it could be harmful? When, Michael?
Well, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Like, you know, like, obviously it's a scab that forms over, like, the blood. Say you kept, like, taking that scab off, why does it leave a scar?
Just because of the way the skin heals after a while, you know, if you keep having that open, it's a longer wound, and the skin, when it heals, it forms a scar tissue rather than healing smoothly. Yeah, and like Mike mentioned, a scab is basically a collection of platelets, and trapped in there are red blood cells and maybe some white blood cells and bacteria and other things, and that's what a scab is. It's there to help you to heal and prevent you from bleeding. Okay?
Well, my mom just told me, I think the other day, that like some guy who was in the Naples movies just died. He was like 47 or something.
Mm-hmm.
He died from a blood clot.
Yeah. So a blood clot, when it forms at the correct time in the correct spot, it's helpful. Helps us stop bleeding so that we don't bleed to death. But there are times when a blood clot forms in the wrong place or at the wrong time. Sometimes a person's blood may just start to clot inside of their blood vessels in their normal blood. And as it's flowing through their body, this blood clot can get stuck somewhere. And basically it blocks the flow of blood to that area of the body. So if a blood clot forms and then it settles in your heart, it can lead to a heart attack. If it settles up in your brain, it can lead to a stroke. If it settles in your lungs, it can cause your blood to stop getting the correct amount of oxygen. So these blood clots that form in other places, they could be bad. And there's medications that can prevent your blood from clotting as much and so forth. But generally, our platelets are helpful to us. They help prevent us from bleeding. All right?
Is that the same thing as an aneurysm?
An aneurysm is like a rupture to a blood vessel. So not quite, but it can lead to some of the same things. An aneurysm can lead to a stroke or a heart attack as well. If we take a sample of blood and centrifuge it, which means spin it around really, really fast, the parts of our blood separate out by density. And if we were to do that, this is what it would look like. The plasma is the least dense. The liquid part, it floats to the top. It's about 55% of our blood. The white blood cells and platelets are a very small percentage, less than 1%. And then red blood cells, the most dense part, make up the rest of our blood. So most of our blood is plasma. The second most is red blood cells. The other stuff is a small portion. Okay, let's talk about these blood vessels. We just mentioned them earlier, arteries and veins. And you guys were correct in telling me some of the differences. So arteries are the blood vessels that carry the blood away from your heart. And in fact, that's one way that you can memorize what they do. Remember, the A in artery goes with A in away, because that's what arteries do, carry blood away from our heart. And arteries are obviously then very important, because they carry this blood to all the different parts of our body. They almost always carry oxygenated blood, most of them. But as we were learning when we talked about the heart, there is one exception. That's the pulmonary artery. Because it's carrying the blood out of the heart to the lungs, that's carrying deoxygenated blood. But most arteries carry oxygenated blood. Most, but not all. Arteries are elastic, sort of flexible. They're strong and they're smooth inside. And as these arteries leave our heart, as we know, the aorta is very large. But as it starts to branch off, it gets smaller and smaller. It's like the branches on a tree. You know, the trunk of a tree starts off very large. Every time it splits off, you have main branches, they get smaller, then they split and get smaller until you have the tiny little twigs at the very end. Well, that's similar to our arteries and veins. They branch off, getting smaller and smaller. So an artery looks like a smooth tube. The walls are pretty thick. They're muscular because they have to withstand a lot of pressure. Every time our heart beats, it forces blood into our arteries. And that exerts a lot of pressure. When they measure your blood pressure at the doctor, they're measuring the pressure of your blood pushing against your arteries. And it's pretty strong. So arteries have to be strong to withstand that pressure. They should be nice and smooth on the inside, although plaques and other things can build up, and we'll talk about that more later on in the unit.
How much pressure is in a heartbeat compared to how deep water pressure is?
Oh, I don't know how to compare them exactly, but like, does anyone know has anyone been to the doctor recently and had their blood pressure taken? Anyone remember the numbers?
That was 105 or 70.
Yeah, it's like usually 100, 110, 120 over a smaller number. What they're measuring is basically the pressure in your arteries when your heart is contracting versus when it's relaxing. Obviously, when it's contracting and forcing blood into your arteries, it's higher, and then when it relaxes, the pressure is lower. You know what they're doing when they do that? You know, they put that cuff around your arm, and then what do? If the nurse is doing it sort of manually, what's next?
Like, they pump something and it tightens it up.
Yeah, but she's listening or he's listening to something. Yeah, they're listening in a stethoscope. They put it on usually in the crook of your elbow. What they're listening for is they pump it up until they stop hearing your pulse. When they stop hearing your pulse, it means the pressure on the cuff is so strong that it basically closed down your artery, and they can't hear your heartbeat there anymore. And then that's the first number. And then they release the pressure, and it starts coming out, and the next number they record is when they can start hearing it again. That's how they measure your pulse rate. Your arteries also, if you feel your pulse, you can feel your pulse. You can feel it pretty well in your neck. If you put two fingers on the left side of your neck and kind of slide them over halfway between the side of your neck and your windpipe, there's like a little indentation here. If you put your fingers in there and stop talking, you can feel your pulse there. You can feel it in your wrist. If you have like a headache or something, you can feel it in your head sometimes. What you're really feeling when you do this, you're really feeling an artery. You're feeling an artery, and every time your heart beats, it forces blood into your artery, and the artery expands. And you could feel that expansion every time your heart beats. So by feeling your pulse, you're feeling every time your heart beats. Arteries are usually fairly deep in our body. They're not really that close to the surface because they need to be protected. If you ever saw in movies or a video game, if somebody damages an artery, gets a cut and it's severed an artery, blood spurts out of it because every time the heart beats at high pressure sends the blood out. So they're generally deeper in our body.
So is that why there's always a gruesome death whenever
Sometimes.
someone dies in a video game?
Sometimes. Veins are usually close to the surface. So that's arteries.
Can you usually see your veins if you look close?
Lots of times, yeah. Especially I have pretty veiny hands. Like on the back of my hand, I can see lots of veins going through your hands.
For some reason I wonder if this is an artery or not, but for some reason I can move something.
No, probably a vein right on the top. All right, so these arteries, they go away from our heart. They branch off. They get smaller, smaller, smaller until they get very, very tiny. They get so small that they're only one cell thick. And they're so narrow that only a single blood cell at a time can go through them. So they're these very, very tiny little blood vessels. And this is where things move in and out of our blood. This is where materials can diffuse into our blood or out of our blood. So in our capillaries, oxygen from our blood can diffuse into our cells of our body. Carbon dioxide from our body cells can diffuse into our blood. Nutrients can come out of our blood. So this is where the exchange of material happens in these things called capillaries. Only a single RBC, red blood cell, can fit through these at a time. And you see that in this diagram. This is a capillary. It's so small that they have to go single file. And as they're moving through, oxygen's diffusing out, waste is diffusing in, and so forth.
What's RBC?
Red blood cell. Right?
Can it go five?
They can, sometimes. If there was a blood clot, it could clot in a capillary. But we have just thousands and thousands of miles of capillaries in our body. Basically, all of your tissue is surrounded by this network of capillaries. So they're all throughout our body. And so arteries, the blood, goes away from the heart. Eventually, they get so small they turn into a capillary. And then the blood, after it gives up its material, starts heading back to the heart. What do we call it then as it heads back to the heart?
Vein.
Then it's a vein. So really, though, they're all connected. Arteries turn into capillaries, which then turn into veins. Which brings us to veins. So veins bring the blood back to the heart. Now, because they're headed back to the heart and the heart isn't forcing blood directly into them, there's much lower pressure in our veins. Most veins carry deoxygenated blood, again, because they're returning to the heart from the body. But again, there is the exception of the pulmonary vein. That carries oxygenated blood. Because these veins don't have high pressure in them, they have a special structure that helps prevent blood from going backwards. It's called a valve. And again, like in the heart, it's basically just a one-way door. So when the blood goes through the veins, it can't go backwards. It goes through these valves, and it keeps moving forward. It's because there's not high pressure in them. So sometimes in a person, these valves can sort of stop working. They can fail. And in that case, sometimes blood can pool in those veins, and they can swell up, and they can be painful. And that's something that's called varicose veins. They've seen somebody, especially as people get older, sometimes they have veins, like in their legs especially, that start to like swell up, and that's because these valves are not functioning properly, and blood is sort of settling in those areas. Any questions about any of these types of blood vessels? So if we look at this picture here, what would you call this? James?
Artery.
It's an artery. But you can see it's branched off so small. What do we call these things? Capillaries. And then they start merging together, and they form veins, correct? So basically they're all interconnected. They're not really separate things. One turns into the other, which turns into the other. So we'll save this diagram for tomorrow. We'll talk about how things move in our capillary.